Daniel had always been a trusting husband. He prided himself on his ability to support Emily's passions, even when they seemed to shift from one interest to another. When she announced that she was taking up baking, he had smiled, encouraged her, and even bought her a set of high-end kitchen utensils to help her along. At first, it seemed innocent enough. She came home every week with a new pastry, flaky croissants, delicate tarts, even an elaborate chocolate soufflé that she claimed had nearly collapsed in the oven. Daniel had marveled at her progress. "You're getting really good," he had told her one evening as he bit into a perfectly crisped apple Danish. Emily had beamed. Practice makes perfect, but something felt off. The pastries she'd brought home were always impeccable, as if they had been plucked straight from the display case of a high-end bakery. There were no signs of trial and error, no failed attempts, no burnt edges. And then there was the way she spoke about baking, vaguely, without any mention of techniques or struggles. When Daniel had once asked her how she managed to temper chocolate so smoothly, she had given him a rehearsed-sounding answer about keeping a steady hand. It was a small thing really, a whisper of doubt, but once planted it refused to go away. One evening, as Emily set a box of eclairs on the counter, Daniel casually asked, "How was class today?" Emily barely looked up as she poured herself a glass of wine. "Good," she said, a little too quickly. "We worked on feelings." That was when Daniel decided to check. The next morning, before heading to work, he searched online for the baking class schedule. It wasn't hard to find. It was a well-known local program at the community center, and Emily had mentioned the name multiple times. Scrolling through the list, his stomach twisted. Her name wasn't there. Every participant was listed, their attendance records visible, but there was no sign of Emily. He double-checked, refreshing the page, hoping he had made a mistake. Nothing. A cold realization settled in his chest. If she wasn't in class, then where was she? That evening, he decided to test her. "Did you get to work with puff pastry today?" he asked casually over dinner. Emily hesitated just for a second before nodding. "Yeah, we made palmiers. Really tricky, but I think I nailed it." A lie. He had memorized the class schedule by now. Tonight, they were supposed to be working on artisan bread. Daniel set his fork down and studied her. She didn't notice, too busy scrolling through her phone. His jaw tightened. Something was going on, and he was going to find out exactly what it was. Daniel had always thought of himself as a rational man. He wasn't prone to jealousy, nor did he have the time or energy for pointless paranoia. But after discovering that Emily wasn't actually attending the baking classes she so often spoke about, his gut told him that something wasn't right. And Daniel had long learnt to trust his instincts. The following days passed in slow motion, each one filled with subtle observations. He noticed how Emily had started dressing a little differently. More effort went into her outfits, even on nights she claimed she'd be in a flour-dusted apron, learning to knead dough. Her perfume, once a subtle floral hint in the morning, now lingered stronger in the evenings, as if she were reapplying it before heading out. And there was the phone. She had always been somewhat attached to it, but now she never let it out of her sight, carrying it from room to room, placing it face down on the table and excusing herself whenever she had an incoming call. Daniel knew that confronting her without proof would only make her defensive. If she was hiding something, she would have an excuse ready. No, he needed to see it for himself. So he made a plan. That Thursday evening, as Emily was getting ready for her supposed baking class, Daniel acted as normal as ever. He watched from the kitchen as she stood before the hallway mirror, adjusting her hair, checking her lipstick. She wasn't wearing the kind of clothes one would expect for a baking class, not the casual attire meant for sticky dough and powdered sugar, but a fitted blouse and a skirt that hugged her hips just right. She caught him watching and smiled. "I'll bring something sweet home for you," she promised, grabbing her purse. Daniel forced a smile in return. Looking forward to it, he waited exactly 15 minutes after she left before grabbing his keys. Tracking her wasn't difficult. He had enabled the Find My feature on both their phones months ago for safety reasons. Emily had agreed at the time, claiming it was practical in case of emergencies. Now, as he pulled up the location on his phone, he realized she hadn't even bothered to disable it. Either she was careless, or she didn't believe he would ever check. The little dot indicating her location wasn't anywhere near the community center where her baking classes were supposedly held. Instead, it was across town, in an area known for its boutique shops, small galleries, and charming little cafes. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he drove, his mind racing through possibilities. Maybe she was meeting a friend. Maybe she had stopped to pick up pastries from a bakery and simply didn't want to admit that she wasn't actually baking them herself. Maybe, but as he turned the corner onto a quiet cobblestone street, his stomach dropped. There she was. Through the large window of a cozy little café, Emily sat at a corner table, her head tilted slightly as she laughed at something the man across from her had said. Mark. Daniel recognized him immediately, the café owner. A man they had met once before when Emily had dragged Daniel here months ago for what she had called the best coffee in town. Back then, Mark had been nothing more than a friendly businessman, a stranger serving espresso with a practiced smile. But now, as Daniel watched him lean in, his hand brushing Emily's as she pushed a plate toward him, he saw something else entirely. She wasn't just sharing a table with him. She was feeding him a bite of cake, her eyes warm with affection. Daniel sat frozen in his car, the scene before him unfolding like a slow-motion car crash. Emily reached for her wine glass, swirling it slightly before taking a sip, all while Mark watched her with an intensity that made Daniel's blood boil. The ease between them, the familiarity, it was the kind of intimacy built over time, not the awkwardness of a new acquaintance. It was then that Daniel realized just how deep the betrayal ran. The pastries, the late nights, the scent of perfume clinging to her when she came home. None of it had been for a love of baking. She had been lying to him, spinning a story as delicate as the pastries she brought home, covering deception with sugar and cream. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He could storm in right now, demand answers, cause a scene that neither Emily nor Mark would forget. But as much as his anger burned, something inside him held him back. No, he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation. Not yet. Instead, he reached for his phone, lifted it just slightly and snapped a picture. Proof. Evidence. A moment frozen in time that would strip away any excuse she might attempt to give him later. Then, with a deep breath, he started his car and pulled away from the curb. Emily didn't know it yet, but the game she had been playing was over. Daniel wasn't sure how long he drove after leaving the cafe. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, his thoughts a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and cold calculation. He had seen it with his own eyes. Emily feeding Mark like a doting lover, her laughter ringing through the candlelit cafe as if she didn't have a husband waiting for her at home. As if the last 15 years of their marriage had meant nothing. He pulled into their driveway just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky a deep shade of purple. The house, their shared home, suddenly felt foreign to him. He sat in the car for a long moment, trying to steady himself, willing his emotions into a cage. He would not explode. He would not give her an easy way out by turning this into an argument she could manipulate. No, he wanted her to unravel, to see the truth reflected back at her with no room for escape. When Emily walked through the front door an hour later, she was humming softly. A small satisfied smile lingered on her lips as she set down a neatly wrapped box on the counter. "I brought you something," she said casually, as if she had spent the evening kneading dough and dusting flour off her hands, instead of flirting over dessert with another man. Daniel stood at the kitchen island, hands resting on the cool marble surface. He didn't move to take the box. Instead, he let his silence stretch, watching her. Finally he spoke, his voice dangerously calm. "How was class?" Emily hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but Daniel caught it. She quickly recovered, flashing him a warm smile. "It was great," she said, untying the ribbon on the box. "We worked on different feelings tonight. Chocolate ganache, fruit compotes. I think I'm finally getting the hang of it." Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her. "Really?" His voice was quiet, almost too measured. That's funny, because I checked the class schedule today. Your name wasn't on it." The color drained from Emily's face so quickly it was almost comical. She blinked, then let out a soft laugh, shaking her head as she started to busy herself with the box. "Oh, that must be a mistake. Maybe they just forgot to update." "Don't," Daniel cut her off, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through her weak attempt at deflection. "Don't lie to me again." Emily froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. She swallowed, forcing a nervous smile. "Daniel, you're being ridiculous. Why would I lie about something like that?" He let out a slow exhale, then reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. With a few taps, he turned the screen toward her. The The image stared back at her and Mark, candlelight flickering between them, her hand holding a fork to his lips. The room fell deathly silent. Emily's eyes widened, darting from the screen to his face, searching for something. An escape route, perhaps? She licked her lips, grasping for words. Daniel, it's not what it looks like. He let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. That's funny, because it looks exactly like what it is. Her breathing became uneven. She took a step forward, reaching for him, but he stepped back, the rejection clear. Daniel, please. Don't, he said again, this time softer but no less firm. Don't insult me by pretending there's an innocent explanation for this. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment Daniel almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then he remembered the months of deception, the stolen moments she had shared with another man while feeding him lies wrapped in sugar. Was it worth it? He asked, his voice quieter now but laced with something raw. Sneaking around, weaving stories, thinking I'd never find out? Was it exciting for you? Emily shook her head frantically. It wasn't like that, Daniel scoffed. Then what was it like? She opened her mouth but said nothing. There was no answer that could undo the damage. No carefully crafted excuse that would erase the image of her with Mark, or the months of deception that had chipped away at their marriage while he had been too trusting to see it. The weight of silence between them was suffocating. Emily wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling when she finally spoke. Daniel, I never meant to hurt you. He let out a bitter chuckle. But you did, and now here we are. She stepped closer again, desperation creeping into her tone. It was a mistake, a stupid mistake. I got caught up in something I shouldn't have, but it didn't mean anything. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then simply shook his head. It meant enough for you to lie to me every single day. Emily let out a shaky breath, rubbing her arms as if she could shield herself from the cold realization settling in. Can we talk about this, please? Daniel studied her carefully. He had thought about this moment on the drive home, had imagined what he would say, how he would react. He could yell, he could rage, he could demand answers to questions that, deep down, he already knew wouldn't satisfy him. But in the end he simply straightened, exhaling as he pocketed his phone. We just did, and with that he walked past her, heading toward the bedroom, leaving her standing there, caught between guilt and the undeniable truth. The silence in the house stretched between them, thick and suffocating, pressing down on Emily with an unbearable weight. Daniel had left her standing there in the kitchen, staring at the cold, undeniable proof of her betrayal still glowing on his phone screen. His footsteps had echoed as he walked away, not in rage, not in heartbreak, but with a finality that chilled her to the bone. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the counter, gripping its edge as if the marble beneath her fingers could somehow ground her, keep her from unraveling. She had rehearsed excuses in her mind countless times, had always thought that if she were ever caught she would be able to explain, to control the damage. But now, standing in the reality of her own actions, she realized how flimsy her justifications were. Upstairs she heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, a suitcase being pulled out. Her breath hitched. "Daniel," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. When he didn't answer, she swallowed hard and forced her legs to move, making her way up the stairs as quickly as she could without running. She found him in their bedroom, moving with quiet efficiency, folding clothes into a suitcase as though he had been planning this for weeks instead of acting on impulse. "You're leaving?" she asked, voice cracking. Daniel didn't look at her. He zipped the suitcase halfway, paused, then opened the closet and pulled out a few more shirts. "Of course. I'm leaving, Emily." His voice was calm, eerily so. Not the tone of a man about to storm out in anger, but the voice of someone who had already made up his mind. She stepped forward, hands reaching toward him instinctively. "Please, don't do this. We can talk about it." Finally he turned to face her. His eyes, once so warm, so familiar, were distant now, like she was a stranger standing in front of him. "Talk about what, Emily?" His tone was tired, hollow. "Do you want to tell me how it didn't mean anything? That it was just a stupid mistake?" She flinched. "It was a mistake," Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "A mistake is forgetting to set an alarm. A mistake is missing an appointment. This," he gestured vaguely between them, "this was a choice, over and over again, and you made it every single time you walked into that café. Every time you told me you were in class." Emily's lips trembled. "I never wanted to hurt you." He let out a bitter laugh. "But you did. And now you want me to sit here and pretend that what? That we can fix this?" She nodded desperately. "I know I lied. I know I broke your trust. But please, Daniel, we have a life together. We have history. That has to count for something." He stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time that night she saw something flicker in his eyes. Pain, deep, profound, and cutting. "It does count for something," he said quietly. "It's what makes this so much worse." Emily took another step forward, reaching for his arm, but he pulled away. The rejection stung. "Daniel, we can go to counseling. I'll do anything." His jaw tightened. "I don't want counseling. I don't want apologies that only come after getting caught." He inhaled sharply, then let out a slow, measured breath. "I just want out." Emily felt something inside her fracture, her vision blurred with tears. "You don't mean that." He held her gaze. "I do." For the first time, she realized there was no fight to be had, no argument that would make him stay. The weight of her actions, the slow, creeping destruction of their marriage, had already done its damage. Daniel turned back to his suitcase, zipped it up fully this time, then lifted it off the bed. He didn't slam it shut, didn't stomp out in anger. Instead, he moved with the careful precision of a man who had given enough of himself already. As he reached the door, he paused. "I'm telling people the truth, Emily." Her stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" He turned back, meeting her eyes with quiet resolve. "Our friends, our family, they're going to know what happened. I'm not going to spin some polite, vague story about us drifting apart." He exhaled sharply. "You spent months lying to me. I'm not going to lie for you." A wave of humiliation crashed over her. "Daniel, please, don't do that. This is between us." He shook his head. "You made it more than just us the moment you brought someone else into our marriage." Emily's breath came in short, shallow bursts as he walked past her, the scent of his aftershave mingling with the sharp sting of finality. She turned, watching as he descended the stairs, her mind screaming at her to stop him, to say something, anything that could change this. But she knew the truth. There were no more words that could fix what she had broken. A few moments later, she heard the front door open, then close. And just like that, Daniel was gone. Emily stood in the quiet aftermath, her body numb, her heart pounding. She turned back to the neatly made bed, the space where Daniel had slept beside her for years, the space that now felt emptier than it had ever been. Downstairs, the box of pastries she had brought home sat untouched on the counter, the ribbon still neatly tied. She stared at it, chest tightening, before slowly sinking to the floor, the weight of her choices settling in. The sweet taste of deception had long since crumbled. All that remained now was the bitter aftertaste of regret.